this Thursday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we are talking NBA Finals takeaways, one from the Mavericks, one from the Celtics. I am also going to give my idea that I stole from somebody else of a way to help fix the NBA playoff problem. And I'm also going to give my way too early top 5 in the Western Conference for the Memphis Grizzlies. Exciting times. Memphis is going to be in that top 5, but where do they land? Stick around and find out. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is indeed your team each and every day. I am Joe Mullinax, and this is Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much. Wherever you're checking out the show, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, thank you for being with me, flying solo on this Thursday edition of the show. DeMichael will be back on the Friday program. Well, he'll have a solo show to take you into the weekend. But it is I, Joe Mullinax, with you on this Thursday edition of the podcast. And speaking of Thursday's edition of the podcast, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, we are free and available wherever you get podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, wherever you get your podcasts. We are happy to be hopefully an everyday listen, an everyday watch for you. However you take in the show, Locked On Grizzlies, a new episode drops. Hopefully you make sure to be with us. I am excited to be with you, dear listener, dear viewer, as always. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the playoff structure. Right? And we're going to talk more about how it could be better because, while I'm not going to disparage the Boston Celtics, they were pretty clearly the best team in the NBA throughout the season. They are deserving and worthy champions. I think the way that they got there could have been better, or at least more fair, since the Western Conference is so amazingly deep and the East is not as deep. And we'll talk about that later in the show. I'm also going to end the disrespect of the Memphis Grizzlies. Take this, ESPN. I'm going to give my top 5 in the Western Conference. Way too early top 5. Spoiler alert, Memphis is going to be on that list. They were not on the list for ESPN, as we talked about on yesterday's show. But I want to lead off today's podcast with some NBA Finals takeaways. Because, again, the Boston Celtics win the championship in 5 games. Pretty clearly the best team. I think they went 16-3 throughout the postseason, only losing 3 games. They finish off the Mavericks in 5. And we'll start with the champions. We'll start with the victors. So the victor goes the spoils, right? And the Boston Celtics look primed and ready to take that 18th banner that they'll be raising on opening night this fall and see you and raise a 19th. They are built to last, at least going into next season. Jason Tatum is primed to get a $300 million contract extension this summer. That's going to happen, you would imagine, almost immediately after the championship celebration, the parade there in Boston. The Celtics look like they're here to stay. So I'm not going to disparage what Boston did at all, but their path was easier, which we'll talk about more later in the show. Not that in this particular instance it may have mattered, but I do think there's an imbalance there, and there has been for some time. My biggest takeaway from Boston being the team that they are is, we've talked about patience before, so I'm not going to go back down that road. It's acquiring elite role players, right? And that goes back to what DeMichael and I talked about on our Wednesday edition of the show, Juneteenth edition. Hopefully everybody had a wonderful day on Wednesday. We talked about the significance of this draft and how Memphis really liking it makes sense because while there may not be superstar talent, there is potential for several really good role players. And I do see that value in a Donovan Clingan. I do see that value, to be honest with you, in a Ron Holland. He may not be ready to do it right now, which is why I don't necessarily want him on the Memphis Grizzlies, but I could see him being a really, really good role player in the NBA, and that has value, especially for teams that already have their superstars or their stars, right? Memphis, in theory, has their star and their superstar in John Morant. They have their stars in Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. They need those elite type of role players. And that's what Boston went out and did. They went out and acquired a Kristaps Porzingis. You could argue the Grizzlies had a hand in this championship for the Boston Celtics because they were a part of the trade that led to Porzingis going to Boston, right? It's what brought Marcus Smart to Memphis. Smart could be an elite role player for the Memphis Grizzlies. He was an elite role player for the Boston Celtics. He just didn't get them to the promised land that they were looking for. Drew Holiday, a better Marcus Smart, essentially, and Kristaps Porzingis did just that. But going out and acquiring those types of players, guys that you got to remember, Porzingis and Luka Doncic were the dynamic duo a few years ago, and it didn't work out, right? It didn't work out with Porzingis and Doncic, and that led to the trade to Washington. So it's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows in these excursions and these explorations with a guy being a second best player on a team as opposed to being the fourth best player on the team, or at best third best, right? And that does matter. We've talked about that before here. Is it a Kyle Kuzma? Is it somebody that is another veteran like a Mikal Bridges? Imagine taking a Mikal Bridges, who's the best player on the Brooklyn Nets right now, and putting him on the Memphis Grizzlies where he'd be the third best player, second best player. How much better would Bridges be in the Memphis structure of things? We'll probably never know, but a guy can dream. So for me, it's acquiring elite role players, players that are immaculate fits. You know, Denny Avdija, I think Kevin O'Connor of The Ringer wrote about yesterday, how Denny Avdija would be a perfect fit as a role player for the Memphis Grizzlies. He doesn't have to be the best player on the team. He could be the fourth best player, the fifth best player. I'd love to have Denny Avdija in the mix here in Memphis. What would it cost? Maybe that's a topic for another future episode. But finding those types of guys when you think you already have the guys, that's an important piece of this that I learned from Boston. From the Mavericks, I'm nervous about the defensive aspect. You know, on a recent episode, we talked about, are the Grizzlies ready for the NBA Finals? Well, what happened to Dallas happened to Memphis. And I think we're at the stage now where, and we talked about this on that episode, I'm not as concerned about that because Memphis hasn't been there before, right? Let's get to the finals, and then we can have some level of concern about what that looks like. I just want to see the Beale Street Blue next to the NBA Finals logo. Let's start there. An NBA Finals game in Memphis? Are you kidding me? Beale Street would be unbelievable going into that game. Hopefully it's a Saturday night. But the reality of the situation with Dallas is Luka Doncic was ready for that moment in terms of being a professional since he was a teenager, right? Being the best player in the European League, the best Euro League there is, the best, second best league in the world next to the NBA, from such a young age, being the MVP of that, having that experience playing at a high level from such a small part of his basketball experience being connected to it. That's amazing to me. He was ready for the scope of the moment, and he just got targeted. Like, you could argue, goodness gracious, like Steph Curry didn't get targeted that much. Jokic didn't get targeted that much defensively. The Boston Celtics just abused Luka Doncic and his lack of ability, especially on rotations. Luka's not a bad on-ball defender, but he really gets lost in various defensive switches and rotations, and Boston took advantage of that. And there were times they attacked him in the pick and roll as well. So I worry about that with John Morant. I see similar issues with Morant, not quite the same, but Morant is not some defensive superstar. And if Luka Doncic can get picked on, John Morant can get picked on. When you get to a series like that and you play against a team like Boston that has so many different players that they can throw at you defensively, that's where the physical limitations of a Desmond Bane can be concerning. That's where the physicality of a playoff series, and how's Luke Kennard getting open? And if you follow Locked On Grizzlies, you know I love Luke Kennard, right? I am a Luke Kennard dude. But I share those concerns of DeMichael's. Can Luke get open against a physical team? The Boston Celtics they're going to know what Luke Kennard can do. So what do you do in those scenarios? How do you get Luke open? Is he able to get open? Is it kind of at the point where he's just not able to? And is that one of the reasons that you have to move on from a Luke to bring in somebody that may be better, including draft capital to sweeten the pot? And how do you find ways to make sure that person can defend so that the efforts of John Morant on that end being limited at times because of the massive usage offensively that's asked of him? Can you improve that? And can Ja's defense improve thanks to the greater offensive burden that Jaren Jackson Jr. took on this past year, Desmond Bane over the last couple of seasons? Can that be distributed more evenly so that Ja can be a better defender, at least in the team aspect? I'm worried about that with the Mavericks. What happened to Luka happening to Ja. And again, the elite role players from Boston. What are some of your takeaways from the NBA Finals? Boston Celtics winning in 5 over the Dallas Mavericks. Let me know in the comments. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, very excited to talk about my idea that isn't fully my idea. I have to be honest. Tom Ziller, I subscribe to his Good Morning It's Basketball newsletter, and he's talked about this for a while. I've adopted the plan. I've signed off on it. Okay, a way to shake up the playoff picture in the NBA. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. I tell you what, Major League Baseball games during the summer, there is not much better than going to the ball game with a hot dog and a drink and sitting down with your family and just enjoying a baseball game. I love going with my wife and kids. It's a great way to spend time together in the summer, and it's a great way to make memories. And I'm planning on the next time I do it, using the Gametime app to do just that. Not just Major League Baseball games, but other major high-profile events all summer long. You can pick out specific games. But for me, it might be a Washington Nationals game. For you, maybe it's the Atlanta Braves, something along those lines. And you can look for good deals. There's last-minute ticket deals that you can get. You can see the view from all seats in the venue, which is really impressive. And, of course, Gametime has the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're talking my plan, Tom Ziller's plan, to fix the NBA playoffs. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode, missing my co-host, Michael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, as I always do when we are apart, and we will be apart tomorrow as well. DeMichael will be taking the Friday edition of the show as I head off on a nice little long weekend with my family, right? The wife and the kids, taking my parents with me. It's going to be beautiful. Very excited about it. Nice long weekend getaway. I'll be checking out the show as I'm sitting on a dock somewhere looking out at the beautiful water. I hope you'll be checking it out as well. I'm an everydayer, and you most certainly should be too. The NBA Finals takeaways, talked about those at the start of the show. My NBA playoff takeaway, it's kind of been this way for years. And Tom Ziller, I want to make sure I shout him out. Good Morning It's Basketball. I've been a subscriber to Tom's newsletter for some time now. Read it every time it hits my email inbox. And he talked about, and he's talked about it before, how the path to the playoff victory for Boston, the championship victory, the path to the parade, if you will, was simpler for Boston than it was for Dallas. And it's simple math. It's win percentage. The win percentage of the teams that the Dallas Mavericks knocked off from the first round to the semifinal to the Western Conference final was simply better than that of the team that the Celtics defeated on their journey. And a major reason for that is the weakness of the Eastern Conference compared to the strength of the Western Conference. For example, in the Western Conference this past season, you had very little tanking. Only four teams had a record below 500, okay? In the East, you had 7. So the 4 teams in the Western Conference that had a record below 500 were the Jazz, the Grizzlies, the Spurs, and the Blazers. The number 11 seed in the Western Conference, the Houston Rockets, not even play-in eligible, were 41-41. And going into next season, you would assume the Grizzlies will be much better. You would assume that a team like the Spurs will be better because of Wembanyama and what he's doing. There is very little tanking happening in the Western Conference. Lots of teams competing for these playoff spots. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Conference, you had a 9-seeded Chicago Bulls and a 10-seeded Atlanta Hawks make the playoff, or the play-in, I should say, with a losing record. In the case of Chicago, it was 39-43, which isn't the end of the world. You see that every once in a while. The Atlanta Hawks made the play-in with a 36-46 record. That is a 44% winning percentage. That's an abomination. That's embarrassing. So Tom Ziller has suggested, and again, I've tweaked it a little bit, but I'm definitely taking a lot of the idea from him, a change to the schedule and a change to the playoff seeding. Now, the change to the schedule would be something along the lines of playing teams in your division 4 times, playing everybody else 3 times. Then you have an in-season tournament. You play 3 games and pool play for that. You play 3 games outside of pool play if you don't make the tournament itself. That gets you to roughly 82 games. Okay, and again, I want to stress, if you do the math on that, it may not work perfectly, but this is a framework, right? Notice that there is no increased number West or East. You're playing everybody the same except for teams in your division, right? That would balance things out a little bit. Then, once you get to the playoffs themselves, instead of it being Western Conference and Eastern Conference, it's seeded 1 through 16. Now, I want to stress, that's not an original idea, right? You probably heard that on other podcasts, read it elsewhere, just to give you an idea of what that would have looked like this past season, okay? So let's say it's the Miami Heat, right, at that 36 or 46 and 36. They would be the 16 seed, and they would have taken on the Boston Celtics as the number 1 seed, right? No major change there. That literally is the exact same thing. The New York Knicks in the Eastern Conference were the number 2 seed. They played the number 7 seed Philadelphia 76ers, right? That was the first round series there. If the 1 through 16 seeding would have occurred, the Knicks, and I will be honest, I didn't go through the tiebreaker, the Knicks at best would have been the number 6 seed overall because the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Denver Nuggets, the Minnesota Timberwolves, and the Los Angeles Clippers all had a better overall record than the Knicks at 50 and 32. That was New York. Again, the Thunder, the Nuggets, the Timberwolves, and the Clippers all had better overall records. And that was in a tougher conference, as I alluded to, at least by record, earlier. Every team in the playoffs and play-in, everybody that made the postseason, was at least 10 games over 500, which is amazing when you think about it. That's amazing. That is a massively competitive postseason race. That was not the case in the Eastern Conference. In the West, you had 5 teams win 50 games. In the East, you had 2. Now, the Boston Celtics, again, none of this is meant to disparage what Boston would do. Boston was a phenomenal team. Boston did some remarkable things in this postseason. They deserve all the credit in the world. In this 1 through 16 format, it's a very high likelihood that Boston would have won the championship anyway. But you would have had different records, would have had different matchups, and they would have been theoretically more competitively balanced. Now, the NBA will never do this, right? They'll say travel, too many complications, you want it to be more regionalized, that sort of thing. We live in 2024, right? This is a magical time where airplanes are more safe and more comfortable than they've ever been. You have television structures and contracts. You can space out these games. There are ways to work around this and to make the postseason more significant because, again, the number 2 seed overall would have been the Oklahoma City Thunder. And instead of the Thunder having to play the Pelicans at 49 and 33, they would have played the 15-seeded Philadelphia 76ers, 47 and 35, right? Now, you could argue maybe that's not as good because of Embiid and health concerns and all that sort of thing. But you can go down the list. The Denver Nuggets would have been the 3rd overall seed. The Nuggets would have played against the 14-seeded Indiana Pacers, right? The Indiana Pacers against the Denver Nuggets. That would have been a different matchup. You would have seen in the second round, instead of the Celtics taking on, either Cleveland or Orlando, you would have likely gotten a matchup with a Western Conference team, right? Somebody that's a little bit more competitive than the way that it worked out in the East. The Western Conference has had competitive imbalance for some time. This is not new. Tom Ziller in that Good Morning It's Basketball newsletter argued that since the second retirement of Michael Jordan, right, basically this entire century, the whole 21st century, the Western Conference has been better than the Eastern Conference. I would argue that is more distinct now than it's ever been. Going into next season, the Pistons are going to stink. The Washington Wizards are going to stink. The Charlotte Hornets are going to stink. The Toronto Raptors are going to stink. The Brooklyn Nets are probably going to stink, especially if they move on from some of these key pieces like we hear. So that's, 10 or so teams competing for 10 or so spots. In the Western Conference, who's going to stink, right? The Trailblazers, I guess. But outside of that, it's going to be a competitive game night in and night out for teams in the West. How fair is that? I would like to see more competitive balance. Let me know what you think. Again, you could still play your division. You still have your rivalries, but spreading out the games across the entire NBA and then reseeding 1 through 16. That would be my playoff picture if I was in charge. But I'm not in charge. Adam Silver is. Hopefully he listens to Locked On Grizzlies. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, I'm giving my way too early Western Conference top 5. Spoiler alert, the Memphis Grizzlies will be included. But first, friendly reminder that this is Locked On Grizzlies. This is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network. If I'm yelling, it's because I'm excited, dear listener, dear viewer. It's because I love you so much, and I'm excited to have the chance each and every time an episode drops that I'm involved in to talk Memphis Grizzlies basketball with you. I've been doing it for over a decade. It's one of my favorite things to do. This isn't Fox Sports. This isn't ESPN. You don't have to turn down the volume because it's a bunch of talking heads talking nonsense. We try to give you opinion backed up with information, analysis, all of that sort of stuff that hopefully you've come to depend on from Locked On Grizzlies. You can get that at Locked On Sports Today as well. It's the first of its kind YouTube streaming 24/7 channel. It has Locked On NBA, Locked On NHL, Locked On Major League Baseball, Locked On NFL, college football, all sorts of different stuff. If you have a favorite team, chances are there's a Locked On podcast for that team, and you can check them out in their show, but you could also potentially check them out in Locked On Sports Today. So make sure you're checking that out over on YouTube. It's also on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by PrizePicks. With PrizePicks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a PrizePicks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. All you need to do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're locked in. PrizePicks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become part of the PrizePicks community today. Maybe you want to do something with Caitlin Clark, right, in terms of her numbers. She's a lot of fun to watch, making more than 3.5 three-pointers. Maybe you're a Breanna Stewart fan. You like Stewie, and you want to see her with more than 23 points. Whether it's the W, Major League Baseball, any other sport, if there's a more than or less than, there's a decent chance you can play it over at PrizePicks. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the PrizePicks app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks. Pick more, pick less. It is quite literally that easy. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, closing out this Thursday edition of the show with my Western Conference top 5. Way too early for it, but we're going to do it anyway. If ESPN can do it, I can do it. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, flying solo, no to Michael Cole. He will be with us on the Friday edition of the show. All sorts of different things that Michael can talk about. We are less than a week away now from opening night of the NBA draft. All sorts of different content coming out about that. I'm sure DeMichael will dive deep looking into all those pieces, the recent firing of Monty Williams there in Detroit. We talked about coaches and their value recently. Maybe he can dive into that. It'll be a great Friday episode. I'll be listening. Make sure you're doing so as well. We talked a lot about the NBA playoffs, NBA finals on this episode, things that I learned from the Boston Celtics, the Dallas Mavericks, ways that I would fix the playoff structure. None of those fixes are going to happen. Right? The NBA is pretty set in their ways. They're more concerned with a ridiculous in-season tournament where the coach that wins it apparently gets fired. That's the prize. Congratulations, Darvin Ham and the Los Angeles Lakers. For me, they are going to continue to do what they're doing. So I'm going to embrace that, and I'm just going to accept it and acknowledge that it's silly in 2024 to do it that way, but they're printing money hand over fist. They're making money hand over fist. They're going to keep riding. So with that in mind, I have a top 5, right? ESPN, I got angry the other day about their way too early rankings that had Memphis at number 19 overall in the NBA, number 11 in the Western Conference, completely outside of the play-in. What a disaster that would be. And if the team is healthy, it's not going to happen, right? You can't assume health for everybody else and then up, but the Grizzlies, they have durability concerns. Well, so does a large amount of the NBA. Here's my top 5, okay? So I'm not going to do the entire Western Conference, because a lot of change can happen, right? What will the Suns look like? What will the Lakers look like? The Pelicans trading away Brandon Ingram potentially. There's lots of movement there. But I do think there are 5 teams that are solid enough that I can rank them right now, all right? Number 5 for me is going to be the Oklahoma City Thunder, all right? Oklahoma City Thunder is number 5 in the Western Conference going into next year. You might ask yourself, Joe, they're one of the youngest teams in the NBA. They were really good this past season, had a lot of success. SGA still exists. Why are you so down on the Thunder? I'm not down on the Thunder. The Western Conference is going to be really freaking hard, and I think the Thunder are going to be really good. But the Thunder had unbelievable health positivity, right? It's unrealistic for them to go into next season and assume that they're going to be as healthy next year as they were this past year. And if they are, that's phenomenal, and I hope that the trainer talks to the Memphis Grizzlies training staff. But the Thunder had so much health luck that it seems improbable for them to have that again. There will likely be a bit of a downturn because they're no longer the hunter. They are the hunted, right? They're not going to sneak up on teams, just like the Grizzlies kind of got that reputation. And, we got to watch out for Memphis now. OKC's going to run into the same thing. So they're still a playoff team solidly. I just have them at number 5 going into next year. At number 4, I have the Memphis Grizzlies. And I could be talked into putting the Grizzlies at 3 next to the Timberwolves. But from what I saw from Anthony Edwards and the Timberwolves in the playoffs, again, you come to Locked On Grizzlies for fair analysis, not just, fan spotting and that sort of thing. I think it is completely fair to have Memphis slotted at 4, assuming the following things. 1, health. Because, again, you can't assume health for other teams and not assume it for Memphis, at least in my opinion. 2, it assumes that Memphis addresses their 3 biggest needs. However they get it done, they get it done. Number 1, big man. Number 2, shooting. Number 3, a defensive wing, right? That can hopefully handle a little bit. For me, it's in that order. They need a big, period, end of story. Doesn't have to be a starter, but they need a traditional true big. They need shooting. I'm with DeMichael on that. Sign off on that 100%. And then that defensive wing, that was one of the lessons I took from Boston. Having a bunch of guys that you can throw at these offensive weapons like Luka Doncic certainly can help. Assuming they do that in some way, shape, or form, all 3 of those things, I've got the Grizzlies at 4. I could be talked into putting them at 3. At number 3, I have the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, at number 3, I have the Minnesota Timberwolves. I was really impressed with how they played. It'll be interesting to see how they address their luxury tax situation. I was impressed with Minnesota in the playoffs, and I think that they are a team that will hang around in the Western Conference near the top. Number 2, I have Dallas, and that might surprise you. Okay, and that might be a little bit high. Again, this is Locked On Grizzlies. I could be talked into putting Dallas there at number 2. Or excuse me, they're at number 3 and Memphis at number 2. I think those top 4 are pretty interchangeable except for the top spot. So I'm going to give the nod to Dallas because of recency bias. Luka Doncic was pretty impressive. Kyrie Irving, that matchup is looking good. You're going to have another year of Derek Lively and all those pieces there in Dallas. I do think there are possible trades that can happen that the Mavericks can try to make to solidify their wing depth a little bit beyond Luka and Kyrie at the guards. I'm intrigued by how they get a third guy, and I think that there's possibilities there. So I'm going to go Dallas at 2. But again, if you want to say Memphis is 2, Minnesota's 3, and Dallas is 4, I'd be fine with that. I'm just trying to be, not a fanboy. For me, number 1 is the Denver Nuggets. And I know that Dallas got past. I know that the Nuggets were down a little bit. They have the best player on the planet in Nikola Jokic. And anytime you got the best player on the planet, you're probably going to be one of the best teams in the conference. So I'm going to go with Denver. I think that Jamal Murray, Aaron Gordon, all of the role players, they are essentially the Boston Celtics of the West in terms of these elite role players. Gordon's a great example of that, right? Aaron Gordon was the best player on the Orlando Magic, and they were mediocre. He comes to Denver as the 3rd or 4th best guy, and he's a heck of a basketball player, and he's a heck of a piece for them in their championship puzzle. So that would be my top 5, okay? I would go Denver 1, Dallas 2, Minnesota 3, Memphis 4, and Oklahoma City 5. But I want to stress, Memphis at 2, yeah, I could hear that. Memphis at 3, I could hear that too. I can't put the Grizzlies at 1. For me, that's Denver. But I could see Memphis. Again, they're not going to be the 11th seed. That is so crazy to me to say that out loud. ESPN should be ashamed. But I've got them at 4 currently. Where do you have them in the way too early top 5 in the Western Conference? Again, if you put them at 2, I don't think that's crazy. Put them at 5, I don't think that's crazy. Anything beyond that, I really struggle with the why, right? They were a 6-3 team with all those guys together without a true big, because Steven Adams still wasn't on the floor. Brandon Clark wasn't out on the floor. I think folks have forgotten how good this Grizzlies team is. They're going to be reminded here soon enough. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It is much appreciated. Again, there will be a Friday edition of the show. DeMichael Cole, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, will take that episode solo, catching everybody up on the latest NBA draft buzz, I am sure, as we are now less than a week away from the NBA draft. Looking forward to listening. Hopefully you will be checking it out as well. YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get podcasts, like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Make Locked On Grizzlies a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every day, each and every time an episode drops. Thank you for being with me on this episode. I will catch you back on Monday. Remember, there will be a Friday show. DeMichael will be with you, but I will be on a beach, on a pier. I'll be hanging out somewhere, enjoying the cool breeze, listening to DeMichael Cole host Locked On Grizzlies. But I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax, saying stay locked in. Check out Locked On Sports Today. Check out Locked On NBA. And make sure that you're subscribed to Locked On Grizzlies on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get podcasts. We are free and available. This is Locked On Grizzlies. Have a good one. Catch you Friday.